Okay, we will start very soon. I know there are already about 60 people online, but we are waiting for a few more as we had more than 100 people registering. So thank you for your patience. We'll start in a couple of minutes. Okay, thank you for being with us today. I think we are going to start now. So we have about 60 people online. We are going to discuss today about Sri Lanka and the current situation, current crisis, and the impact on micro-entrepreneur, microfinance with the examples of Sejaya. Let me share with you first an introduction of the topics and an introduction about our speaker. So we'll cover a couple of points, including the current situation in Sri Lanka, as I mentioned, the consequence on the population. We'll also look at the impact on microfinance in Sri Lanka, and also try to discuss what kind of strategies can microfinance institutions adopt to support the population. Today, there will be, after this introduction, a couple of words about Gojo and its history in Sri Lanka by Tejun. Then we'll update everyone on the current situation, the macroeconomic situation, and the update on the crisis. Satish will kindly do that for us. Then we'll go more into the depth of the impact on the crisis on microfinance, and Nirmalan, which I'll introduce in a minute, will also share that with us. Then we'll have a panel discussion and we'll take questions from the floor. So please don't hesitate to ask questions all along this presentation. I will take note of your question and make sure that as we go into the concluding panel discussions, we will basically take all of your questions. I may ask some of the panelists to address your question during the conversation, but the most likely is that we'll keep your question for the conclusion, but please go ahead and ask questions during the entire session. Let me introduce our speaker. So we'll start with Nirmalan, Nirmalan Nayagam, who is the CEO of Sejaya in Sri Lanka. He has more than 25 years of experience in the corporate sectors and moved to microfinance for the last 15 years. Initially the CFO and regional director for Asia and Eastern Europe. He is now the CEO of Sejaya and is leading the company through this crisis. We'll cover it in a few minutes. We have also Satish Selvanathan, who is a board member of Sejaya, but he's also the executive chair at Premium Vegetable Oils, co-founder of the Lanka Environment Fund, which provides grant to environmental groups in Sri Lanka. Satish is also an ultra-marathon athlete and a great competitor. And he also worked in private equity, management consulting, investment banking before his current position. So it will be very interesting to have Satish's views on Sri Lanka and the macroeconomic situations and the impact of the crisis. And obviously we have Tejun, the co-founder of Gojo, and Tejun was an experience in before creating Gojo in private equity. Will tell us more about how Gojo has invested in Sri Lanka and how Gojo has, what Gojo is currently doing to support Sri Lanka. I will be just moderating this session and the discussion. So to start, let me just hand over to Tejun to tell us more about how Gojo went into this investment in Sri Lanka. Tejun, I hand over to you.
All right, thank you, Arnaud, and thank you everyone for coming. And I'm Tejun, co-founder and CEO of Gojo and Company. Thank you for joining. And then I would like to be just very quick and short because I think we would like to spend more time to understand what is really happening in Sri Lanka and what's going to come to the nation later. Gojo is a holding company of financial inclusion space. And we started a company 8 years ago. We established a company on 4th July. So it's just freshly, the 8 years fresh. And now we are working in 5 countries. And as a group, we serve 1.3 million customers in these 5 countries, namely Cambodia, Myanmar, India, Tajikistan, and Sri Lanka. We started our operation in Sri Lanka. The preparation process started in 2014. And then the next year, 2015, June, we started the operation in Sri Lanka. We established a company from scratch under the name of Sejaya Microcredit. The reason why we started the business in Sri Lanka was that when I first visited Sri Lanka was 2014, and I was very impressed by the people and the country. I felt that the country has a very bright future because the country just finished its civil war, long-lasting civil war. And my rule of thumb is that any country which experiences civil war would experience peace for the time being because people are, basically fed up with any conflicts. And that is one of the reasons why we started a business in Sri Lanka. And then the country has a very high education level. And if you look at the number of certified accountants per population, Sri Lanka is the one of the best in the world, actually. So I thought that it is a great place, and compared with the quality of the human resources, I felt that the GDP per capita of the nation is much, much lower. So I thought that there is a good growth potential. And on top of that, because of the lower GDP per capita, there are many people who need financial services, namely microfinance. And then that is why we started the company in 2015. And despite many challenges, I'm very glad that what we have achieved so far. And I'm pretty much looking forward to hearing from Satish and Nirmalan today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tejun. Thank you very much. Let's now move to try to understand better the Sri Lanka. Some of you may know the country as well as Tejun and our panelists. I'm actually personally less experienced about Sri Lanka, so I'm very interested to have Satish tell us more about the country in general and focus about the crisis that the country had to face in the past, including the current crisis. Satish, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Arno. And thank you, Tejun, for the intro as well. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our webinar participants from wherever in the world they're tuning in from. So just a little bit of context. I sit on the board of Sejaya. I'm a recent addition to that board. I lived in Sri Lanka for the first 17 years of my life, and I've been outside since then. Having said that, I have strong familial and business ties to the country, so it's something that's close to my heart. What I thought I would do is I thought I would take you through 3 areas that I think is important for everyone to understand the genesis of this crisis. I thought I'd take you through some historical context, then the catalyst of what it is that caused the crisis specifically, and third, I will focus on the result. I've deliberately left out the response, and I do this because I am not an economist, and I think the issues that Sri Lanka face are a lot more deep-seated than I'm able to compute intellectually. So I think I will leave the response to people who are far more qualified than I am to comment on this. So just in terms of the context, so I'll start with the context first. I'm going to take you through two sub-buckets. One is the quantum of debt, and the second is the economy itself. So in terms of the quantum of debt, Sri Lanka has been running a primary deficit for many, many years. And what changed was that in 2005, the government started to fund this deficit via their access to the international sovereign bond market. And they did this at commercial rates. What resulted is that the quantum of debt actually increased 8 times from 2005 to 2020 to 2021. I think at the end of 2021, that was close to $40 billion in debt. Secondly, in terms of the economy, focusing on the revenue drivers, the key drivers of the Sri Lankan economy is tourism, worker remittances, and the export of tea for US dollar earnings. As you can imagine, all 3 of these things took a hit during the last a couple of years, and I'll get into that in my next section. In terms of a cost structure, Sri Lanka has one of the highest state-owned sector employment metrics. The last time I checked, I think it was 1.5 million people were employed by the state, and roughly 85% of the country's tax revenues were spent on salaries and pensions. So as you can imagine, a very, very large chunk of the earnings go out into paying these workers. And the third matter, also on the cost side, is the fact that Sri Lanka subsidizes a high percentage of its basic raw materials. So, for example, fertilizer, power, water, these are sort of the 3 items that are sold to industry and to consumers at lower than the market rate, and certainly lower than the cost of production. So, you know, when you think about the fact that revenues have dried up because of tourism, because of the hit that COVID has played in tourism, revenues have dried up from workers sending their money back. I will get to tea exports shortly, but revenue has also dried up in that. So when you combine a lack of revenue, when you combine higher cost, and when you combine them with a higher debt burden, you can see where the genesis of this problem started to form. I will now spend some time on the catalyst of this specific crisis. So again, focusing on the debt side, what was the debt used for? Typically, developing countries like Sri Lanka would borrow debt to invest in ROI projects, infrastructure, or something else that is going to be of productive use to the country. We did not do that. We spent this money primarily on white elephant projects that would have typically appealed to the egos of our leaders and less on the ability to generate revenue. One example of this is the fact that we built a second airport in a very, very sleepy town in the south. I think the only reason that was done was because the former president is from that town. So, as you know, when you spend billions of dollars on projects to serve yourself, what happened is not exactly surprising. Secondly, in terms of the economy, 4 drivers. In terms of tax revenues, the government very, very suddenly decided to reduce the tax rate. This was done, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in 2018 or 2019. This was done for a personal tax, corporate tax, and indirect tax. And the result of this was that obviously tax revenues fell in terms of a quantum, and they also fell in terms of percent of GDP. A second revenue driver is tourism. Sri Lanka, as you know, as you probably know, had a 20+ year civil war that ended in 2008. And since then, tourist arrivals in the country have been growing. 2018 was a peak year for tourism. We had about 2.3 million tourist arrivals. In 2019, however, we had a set of Easter Sunday where a church was bombed and 2 or 3 hotels in Colombo were attacked. And what this resulted was in a very, very sharp fall in tourism. Fast forward to 2020, COVID takes over. And I think the tourist arrivals in that year was like 500,000 people. Fast forward 2021, COVID is still on. Tourist arrivals was something like 200,000 people. So as you can imagine, tourist arrivals and therefore revenues on the year, foreign earnings has fallen quite significantly since 2018. A third item is remittances. Typically, Sri Lanka has a large set of workers that go abroad and they send money back. Those remittances dried up because there was a sense that the government were artificially holding the exchange rate at 200 rupees to a dollar, and those numbers dried up. You combine all those 3 things with higher debt service, which, if I'm not mistaken, amounted to something like $7 to $8 billion a year in terms of interest and principal. And as you can see, it's a perfect storm for something very, very bad to happen. Then finally, in terms of the result, what happened? A couple of things. Inflation went through the roof. I think inflation as of June 2022, year on year, was 54%. I think food inflation is close to 80%. So these are very, very stark numbers. A second thing that happened is your currency just went through the floor. The Sri Lankan rupee was around 200 rupees to a dollar for many, many years. It is currently at 354. It has gone as high as 400, and this has all happened in the last 3 or 4 months. I think sort of following on from that, exports have become more expensive. Currency reserves have pretty much dwindled to next to nothing. The country has a hard time buying basic materials, which is, food, medicine, paper for government exams, fertilizer. So, all in all, there are fairly significant issues for basic needs like fuel, food, medicine, power, things like that. And I think the other issue that we have is imports are not possible. You obviously need a foreign exchange to buy imports. Sri Lanka is a net importer of food. It's a net importer of energy. So those things are very, very hard to come by. And I think finally, even in terms of food security, we have issues. Like I said, a fertilizer was a chemical fertilizer was stopped. Food yields have come down, and food security is also now starting to become a problem. So with that, let me just pause there. And so, Parno, we're going to take questions at the end, right?
Exactly, Satish. Well, I think, by the way, if people have questions, they should not hesitate to ask in the Q&A box and type their questions. We'll probably take the questions at the end anyway. So thank you very much, Satish, for your this presentation. I think it's quite comprehensive and it also gave a good kind of historical context of in which this crisis is taking place. So with that being said, I suggest we move straight away to the more specific impact of the crisis on the microfinance sector. And then I will directly hand over to Nirmalan And so, Nirmalan, maybe you can share this your views on the impact on microfinance, including you can tell us more about the situation at Sejaya and the current impact on a company like Sejaya.
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's nice to have you all on the call. Can we move to the next slide? Yeah, I will give a brief overview of Sejaya, where we currently stand. So we heard that Sejaya was incorporated in 2015. It's a licensed microfinance company under the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, one of the 4 licensed companies in Sri Lanka. As of date, we have a portfolio of about $5.6 million, out of which approximately 80% are in the rural areas. We have staffing around 277 staff. We work across the country covering 23 districts and through 26 branches. So we are covered island-wide. And as of date, we have approximately 53,000 clients, out of which almost 93% we follow the group lending methodology and 7% is individual lending. So with the onset of this crisis, we experienced quite a few challenges in how we conduct this business. This was not only restricted to Sejaya, but across many industries and also specifically the microfinance industry as well. Some of the key challenges we encountered were, if I may look from the client side, with inflation taking its toll as high as 58% year-on-year and food inflation at 80%, it affected all stratas of the society. Cost of living skyrocketed, and naturally our clients also were affected. We had clients who were able to make repayments, but they were part payments. Some of the clients started making part repayments. There were clients where who were impacted through their employment or the businesses they were doing. Input costs were high, or it was scarce, the likes of fuel or any other inputs. And so they didn't want to take new loans or invest in new ventures or expand their businesses. So they just continued at the current level. Or some of them, like especially like people who are into masonry, carpentry, mechanics who worked in restaurants, have had no businesses at all, given the crisis currently we are facing. And it impacted the clients on those areas as well. However, one thing which we noticed was, or came across was, especially in the rural agri sector, we found that the clients had a very simple lifestyle. They had cattle, chicks, farming in their gardens, and they were able to sort of survive the food crisis or manage with a simple lifestyle because they were self-sufficient by their own means. And this helped them like to continue doing their businesses and maybe even investing a little bit more in their businesses. So these were some of the areas where we saw how it impacted our clients. If we move into how Sejaya has been in fact impacted, I think the main issue has been on the lack of fuel. The microfinance operations are dependent on officers visiting the centers and collecting money at the center points. And we have had shortages of fuel or fuel being rationing. And right now with hardly any fuel at all in the country. This has impacted our business considerably. And we are looking at or working on alternative methods or avenues on how we do collections with our clients. So that has a major issue. The lack of fuel has been a major issue in how we conduct our operations. With clients making part payments, of course, the non-performing loans have increased gradually. So this is an area we are currently working on, and it has been across the industry, but also even in the banking and the finance company sector, we see that it's increasing. Post-COVID, from October last year, when we came out of all our lockdowns, we saw a tremendous improvement in our performance. So the whole industry saw performance improving with NPS going down. But come Q2 this year, April, May, June, we see that the PAR has been rising gradually, and this has been a challenge in how we address it. With inflation being high, our cost of operations has increased significantly. As you may be aware, fuel prices increased by over 250% when you compare with December last year. And this has had an impact on how we do our business. Also, there are other areas like where we have scarcity of items as basic things like paper. There were times where you couldn't even get a photocopy paper, or like the price of photocopy paper had just quadrupled overnight. So there are challenges in obtaining essential items which we need for our business, and this has impacted us in increasing operating costs. In terms of staffing, staff have been challenged, of course, with the increased cost of living, but also other areas like commuting costs, bus fares, whether it be with the increase in fuel costs, how they come to office has been a challenge. And we are looking at ways of how they can work from home and so on. Another thing which has impacted many, including our staff, is the lack of gas. Gas is a common energy which is used for cooking, and there has been a big shortage of gas in the country. And so right now, like, people are looking at alternative ways of cooking, whether it may be firewood, charcoal, or electrical appliances for cooking. And on top of that, we are facing power cuts for a day, twice, 2 slots during the day. Of course, it has been lesser compared to maybe in April, but still for all, we do have power cuts during the day, almost every day. So the central bank in April increased the policy lending rates by 700 basis points, and this had an impact on our borrowing rates as well. Borrowing rates almost doubled in this last quarter, and banks are hesitant to lend now without any hard collateral. So banks have actually stopped lending, except unless you have some hard collateral. So these are some of the key challenges which we faced in this last quarter, commencing from start of the year. Another area was our interest rate was capped. The interest rate had been capped by the central bank for the licensed MFIs, and so we were unable to increase our interest rates so far, but this cap has been lifted fairly recently. So we went through all these, like in the last 2 to 3 months, without adjusting our interest rates and managing with our current pricing structures. So these were some of the challenges which we faced and how it had impacted in the microfinance business. Anand?
Nirmalan, thank you very much for the presentation, which is quite comprehensive. I will directly, and I think we'll directly move on into Q&A and discussion part. We have already questions coming from the audience. Basically, I'm going to rely those questions as much as I'm going to also extend to other topics we want to cover, and other questions I have. As I speak, please again, for the audience, we have about 80 people in the audience, so don't hesitate to ask questions, even for those that have not been able to attend since the beginning of the session. Please don't hesitate to look at the Q&A section on Zoom and ask your questions. So let's directly jump into the questions we have. I will start with actually general questions on Sri Lanka. We have this question from Jean-Michel about the inflation rate. And Satish, you covered that, but maybe you want to provide a bit more color on the main reasons for inflation in your view, and we'll see whether Nirmalan wants to complement that.
Thanks, Arno. Gosh, where do I start? Inflation is 4.5%, right? 80% in terms of food, probably higher in terms of fuel. I guess when a country's currency is depreciated 80%, and in 3 months, and when that country is also dependent on imports for so much of its basic, domestic inflation is going to increase. I would largely expect the depreciation of the local currency. Nirmalan, do you have a different or a slightly?
Yes, Satish. I think it's the depreciation plus actually with the lack of dollars and shortage of you're unable to import stuff. So the demand is there, and prices have been going up overnight. So basically, you see that as the main reason. Like if you look at medical supplies, there is a huge the prices have increased, and that's because of you're not having the dollars to bring in the medicines. So I think it's the lack of dollars which is causing ripple effects right across economies into various sectors, inflation, and so on.
So we say devaluation, lack of dollars, and this leads to not being able to import enough, and so lack of merchandise, and therefore rarity, which leads to inflation.
I think Nirmalan also touched upon the fact that there is a pretty basic material. Nirmalan, I have read that many schools cancel exams because of this. So if you can't stump up the money to buy photocopy paper, and if you can't stump up the money to exam manuscripts, prices are going to go up. It's only normal.
Thank you, Satish. Thank you, Nirmalan. Let's move to other questions we have in the panel. We have a very broad and general questions, which will allow you to develop your imagination. So, Kerm is asking the main course which have led to this crisis, course countries that have led to this crisis in your view, and any views on what will be the ways for Sri Lanka to recover the crisis? I mean, what are the options on the table? And again, Satish and Nirmalan, you are the experts, Sri Lanka much better than us. Maybe you can share your view on that.
Nirmalan, I take the first question. I think you should take the second question.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I mean, the causes, I think I touched upon some of them. Debt quantum that increased 8 times between 2005 and 2021. an economy that has structural weaknesses. Revenue drivers, tourism, remittances, export of tea. These all suffered massively during COVID. Tourism and remittances suffered massively due to COVID. Tea exports suffered because of the switch to organic fertilizer. Huge fixed cost structure. Like I said, 85% of the government tax revenue spent on state sector salaries and pensions, and huge cost of subsidizing basic raw materials. So when you combine a structural deficit in the economy with a huge debt burden, the cause of the crisis is pretty clear. There's a lovely quote from a very, very good macroeconomist called Rudiger Dornbusch, and he talks about how it always takes longer than you expect for something to happen, but when that happens, it happens faster than you expected. And I think what happened in Sri Lanka in the last 3 months, you could see the writing on the wall for probably 3 years. In 2019, Nirmalan, please correct me if I'm wrong, in 2019, many economists talked about the government needing to get IMF support. That was not done. In 2020, the IMF themselves advised the government to get financial advice. That was also not done. Talking to the IMF took until probably 1 or 2 months ago to take place. So when you get a huge amount of debt coupled with a structurally weak economy, coupled with I don't know what the politically correct word is, but I guess an incompetent and self-serving government, you have all of you have a perfect storm for something like this to happen. Let me stop there.
So that was just the call. So now Nirmalan has the most exciting part, which is what is the way out of this?
Yeah, so right now it's basically how it's being managed is you're just going behind countries to borrow for fuel and essential commodities. Till June, they have been utilizing the credit line, the Indian credit line for fuel. And I think that's exhausted now by June. And some of the measures the government has taken was like they're encouraging people to go overseas, work and send in the remittances. And they have even given leave for government servants to go overseas. So that's one area which they're looking at. And another area is, of course, they have to look at get investments into projects into the economy. That's something which we don't hear much yet. But of course, they have brought in a new member of parliament into a minister in charge of investments. He has been a businessman, successful businessman, and so he has been brought in. So it's to be seen like what are the initiatives he comes up with. Of course, they are looking at the IMF and some of the criteria they have already started working on, especially in terms of increasing taxes. So they have already revised on the tax reductions which they gave in 2019, like corporate income tax up from 24 to 30 by the end of this year, and personal income tax thresholds have also been brought down. So yeah, and then they are looking at at restructuring the debt. They have roped in, I think, a foreign agency to help them in restructuring the debt. And these are basically to meet so that they can meet the IMF conditions. So the way forward, basically, I think one critical thing I see is fuel, gas. I think those are critical areas which has to be addressed immediately. And if those are supplied without interruption, I think that will reduce some of the stress people are going through and revive some of the businesses. So that's what we see even in the microfinance sector. I think if we have fuel, I think that's one of the key areas where many say that you can manage. And same with gas. Like there are industries very much dependent on gas, and like right now everything's at a standstill. Hope I answered the question.
Yes, thank you very much. And Nirmalan, so we have many more questions, obviously, and let's move to some questions. But we have a couple of questions about the specificities of Sejaya operation. So we'll move to that. We'll come back to more global questions about the crisis in a moment. So there are questions which are very specific about the current level of portfolio at risk at Sejaya, and maybe you can also tell us in the sector in general in Sri Lanka. Questions about the average interest rate also at Sejaya, but also globally in Sri Lanka. And then there are more specific questions about some measures you have taken. For instance, there are questions about if you have done any specific layoff, if you have also reduced your lending. And the question was about more, did you do, because you reduce your lending, did you do layoff because you won't lend as much? So maybe you can address those questions, Nirmalan, to the audience.
Yeah. So in terms of measures taken, actually, I'll start from the last question. We have not laid off any staff actually right now. So we have stopped recruiting any new staff unless it's a replacement or if it's actually required. And we have not laid off any staff. Just in ways of how we work, basically, in terms of collections, we are looking at how we can manage our collections, through digital means or through supermarkets or center leaders going to banks. Those are some of the ways we are managing right now. And like even officers have now resorted to traveling by bicycles, and I see that across competitors as well, who are using like for shorter distances, like up to 10 kilometers or so, they travel by bicycles and do collections or go by public transport wherever possible. So in terms of PAR, actually PAR has been increasing from Q1 to Q2. So from March to June, actually, we see that PAR has been increasing. PAR 30, I would say, has been increased. Of course, one also has increased from around like 12 to 15, and I see that it's quite comparable within the industry. And PAR 30 also has been increased within the range of 8 to 10 within the industry. So we have been talking, like the 4 registered microfinance companies, we have been talking through some of these areas, and it's quite comparable. On interest rates, actually, I'm assuming it's the lending rates. So it was.
It was the lending rate, yes, indeed.
I think he was frozen.
He is maybe frozen, yeah. I thought it was a question to me, actually. Interesting. Okay, let's maybe move to another questions as he comes back, before he comes back. There are obviously many more questions on Sejaya, and we'll move to those questions in a minute when Nirmalan is back. But before there, Nirmalan, you're back?
Yes, sorry, something happened to my connection.
Yeah, apologies. So we were talking, you were about to tell us about the interest rate, the interest rate.
Yes, so interest rates.
Indeed, this is your lending rate, yeah.
Yeah, so it was capped at around, at the effective rate of 35, all inclusive. And the sector was within that, like the registered finance companies were within 32 to 35 effective, whereas the unregistered were already at a higher level than 35. And with the cap being lifted right now, within the registered MFIs, they're looking at around 40 to 42. And there may be, the lowest may be around 39, whereas I've heard of some MFIs moving up to 44 and even 46 as well. This is all-inclusive rate, including the fees.
Thanks, Nirmalan. There is an additional question on this specific topic of current microfinance, let's say, operation is there was in the past intervention from the government in the microfinance sector, specifically relative to debt forgiveness. And this obviously has impacted client disciplines and client willingness to repay. Is there any indication that the current government could push this type of measures?
So there was one in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, yeah, where they came up with a debt forgiveness. We have not heard of anything to that extent. I don't think they would go to that level right now. It depends on, so I've read that they're looking at a relief package to help the poorer communities, but as to how it may be most likely in the form of dry rations and food packs. So it's very unclear how those relief measures would turn out to be right now. So it's quite difficult to say whether this would come or not. But when it came back in 2018, like many felt it was more of a populist move at that time, came from the Minister of Finance at that time.
Thank you, Nirmalan. Thank you. Let's move back to a more global question before we again go back to Sejaya and microfinance. There are a couple of questions about the possible, political changes. I understand that in the recent requirement of a package from the IMF, there was a discussion with IMF requesting that there is a stable and functioning government. Do you see this as leading potentially to political change? Satish and Nirmalan, what are your views on that?
Satish, would you like to go first?
I was going to suggest the opposite, Nirmalan. I'm a little bit removed because I'm not physically there, so you're probably the best man to take this.
I know it's a bit touchy question for Sri Lanka people to answer. So let me say something. And so IMF obviously is asking for the complete change of the government. And so there has been this Rajapaksa family which ruled the country for more than 2 decades, except for just 5 years when they lost in the general election. In the last general election, they lost for the first time in the last 20 years because people were fed up with nepotism. But unfortunately, after that, the terror attack came. During the Easter season, there was a terror attack on churches and etc. And then suddenly people became very nationalistic, and then the Rajapaksa family swung in again to the power. That's in my opinion, very unfortunate thing because I haven't seen any hard facts, but many people are saying that many government-backed the infrastructure projects and everything, the money went to the family, the Rajapaksa family, and then they piled up huge amount of wealth, mainly outside of the country. So their wealth already is outside of the country, allegedly. And then the IMF and the other international donors are aware of the situation, and they are asking for the complete change of the government as a prerequisite of their support. However, I don't know whether the Sri Lanka government, or more precisely the Rajapaksa family, will be able to accept this, because the acceptance of this would mean that there surely political death, and also I think there will be charged for many criminal cases, embezzlements, etc. So that's the situation that I understand, and okay, you both are nodding, so I think I gather that I described the truth to the great extent.
Yes,
that's
I
a
think,
difficulty.
yeah, and so we had many in the family in parliament, and so two have already left their positions, like the prime minister and the former finance minister, and the president is still there. So there is like protests still around the country asking the president to step down. So that's something we'll have to see what happens there in the political front.
Sorry, Nirmalan, just I don't want to interrupt, but there is a question about this, and maybe you can elaborate on this. Is the level of civil unrest in the country that you mentioned some protests? So number one, the first question is: do you think the level of civil unrest could lead to political change? And number two is: did that type of protest and civil unrest led to any? Did it have any impact on your operation?
So most of the civil unrest like are happening like in around Colombo and like in some of the main towns outstation. So we have not had any disruptions in our operations in the past due to that, except for maybe in May when we had the clashes and then the curfew was imposed. Generally, these protests are basically calling out, generally peaceful and calling out for the resignation of the president. So, if everything is centered around it, of course, there have been some unrest with regard to fuel or gas, like people blocking the streets because there is no gas, or there has been some fight in a fuel station while waiting for fuel and people jumping queues, and there has been some unrest around that. But otherwise, generally, it has been a peaceful protest around the country.
Thank you, Nirmalan. Let me, we have 5-6 minutes left, so I'm not sure whether we will be able to address every question. Let me ask still a couple of general questions about the country and the situation, and then go back to a question about the what can we do to help, and what can we do to support our clients and the beneficiaries. So for the global questions that we have, I think there are a few of them that you could also provide some clarification. And do you see any specific industries or sectors which are either very much gaining or losing from this situation? So that's one of the questions we have. The second one is about let's say the geopolitical situation of Sri Lanka, and the question is about whether there is any influence of China over the country in general, and specifically maybe in this context. And then we'll move to some more specific questions about what can we do to help the situation.
So with regard to influence of China, most of the projects in the past was done through loans from China, whether it was the airport in the south or other projects. Most of it was done with Chinese loans. But of late, what we see is we see India stepping up, and I think even Japan is stepping up. And personally, I felt China has been a bit quiet. I may be wrong, but I've heard more about India and Japan and some other countries stepping up to support Sri Lanka during these times. So, and again, like one thing which I've read was like that China has not been that happy on some of the projects which were stalled or whatever. So, but in general, my feeling is like there are other countries also coming into play, especially India and Japan. And moving into the other question, like what industries are going to are like losing or gaining during these times, like in terms of losing, like quite a lot of the industries have been affected, but in terms of like they are looking at the petroleum industry. Now they have opened out, you can previously it was just 2 companies, and now I think you can bring about more, so you can have more companies coming in, so that may be an area where companies can gain. Yeah, other industries.
Services, Nirmalan, if you're a
Yeah.
service, a dollar-based order book.
Sorry?
With a service company with a dollar-based order book, you're probably going to win, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Or some kind of IT service company.
Yes, IT services, definitely.
And if there's any business that is importing a large amount of raw materials or is reliant on a large amount of power to run manufacturing, you're going to lose. Right?
Yes.
Right.
So thank you. Let's conclude. We have a few more minutes. Let's conclude on a very important questions, which I'm not sure if it's the most important, but possibly the most important of this discussion is really what can we help to do to our micro entrepreneurs or small clients? What can we do? So there are a few questions and suggestions where I would like your feedback. So the overall topic is what can Sejaya and what can Gojo do to help more to help address this situation. There are suggestions about a loan guarantee scheme. Do you think that that type of things could help and could bank be more active if there was such a loan guarantee scheme? And obviously there is the overall issue of food security, which seems a very important issue at the moment in Sri Lanka. And so the overall question is what level of humanitarian assistance is needed for food security, and then I will extend to what can Gojo and Sejaya do in this context. And so I would want to address the question specifically to Tejun and Nirmalan. Nirmalan, you can share at Sejaya level and what is currently being done, and Tejun can also share the initiatives that Gojo has taken. Nirmalan, would you like to start?
Yeah. So in terms of how we are going to support our staff, we are looking at welfare activities towards our staff. That's something which we are working on right now, and see how we can continue to support our staff during these challenging times. In terms of supporting clients or communities, we are working together with Gojo and touching on the subject of food security into how we can help the communities and the clients. Tejan, would you like to elaborate further?
Yeah, so we long discussed this. The one thing which was clear to us all was that we will take any action to support the people in the country. And then the debate that we had was around how, because there already are some international organizations, international NGOs doing some operation. However, we found that due to the fuel price crisis, the local logistics is in trouble. And we concluded that rather than relying on the international actors, we can do our job by using our branch network. And this time, currently, we are thinking of supporting elderly people, children in orphanages, and pregnant women. This time, we are not going to use any income criteria, because income criteria this time is very tricky. People working on agriculture are relatively better off because they have food in hands and they can sell the food at a higher price. So rather than using income, we specify our beneficiary segments according to the demographic definitions, and that's what we are going to do. Just recently, Gojo established a Gojo Foundation, and we are going to launch our fundraising scheme in the next week. And I will send you all the link of our fundraising efforts later. And it would be great if you could join us. Thank you. One more thing, last but not least. So some people might wonder whether Gojo as a shareholder would stay in Sri Lanka or not. And our answer is yes, we are going to stay. So in the last 8 years, we have had many troubles. Just before Sri Lanka, just 1 year ago, we had a coup in Myanmar. And our discussion and the conclusion was always the same, which is whenever there are people who need adequate and useful financial services, then we will be there. So we are very clear that people need proper financial services to manage their cash flow, especially under the circumstances. So as long as our potential clients are there, we will continue doing the business. On top of that, if you escape from a country when a country is in a trouble, it's very difficult for you to come back and for you to find out the trustworthy people and for you to maintain the trust relationship. It is very, very important. And that is why we have not exited from Myanmar and we are not going to exit from Sri Lanka. Last but not least, I'm very hopeful about the future of Sri Lanka. As I said in the opening remark, whenever I go any places, I used to have a training program for the colleagues of our group companies. And Sri Lankan colleagues were always quickest in understanding anything, any new concepts. So I fear that the general education level, literacy level of the people in the country is relatively very high. And that has a huge potential. And that I believe the key thing is how to unleash the full potential of the human resources of the country. And that unfortunately has not been the case under the current government. But I'm quite hopeful. And then I hope that the current crisis will be the wake-up call for the country.
Thank you very much, Tejun, Nirmalan. Thank you, everyone. I think we are just a few minutes over the time allocated. So I know there were more questions to address. Unfortunately, we have delayed a little. So please don't hesitate to write us and interact with us, either on LinkedIn or directly writing to us. As I said, thank you very much for the presentation. And we hope to see you, the audience, soon in the next webinar we'll be conducting. We will be sending, I think, a few questions as we are every time trying to improve to get your feedback on the webinar. So please don't hesitate to answer. Thanks everyone again, and I will now close this panel and conclude.